If these really are to be the final days and hours of this war, in Gaza they still follow a familiar merciless course. 9 people killed in an Israeli airstrike overnight on a family home in southern Khan Yunis.
They're children. My niece was 18 months old. My sister was 7 months pregnant. Her sister-in-law just gave birth 2 weeks ago. They didn't even name the baby.
Nearby, other family members mourning at a hospital morgue. Allah grieving for his brother.
We were saying, thank God, there will be a ceasefire and we'll all go back to Rafah, but he wasn't destined to return.
The emerging ceasefire that came too late for this family, seemingly little changed from the one that's been on the table for months. From the talks in Qatar, confirmation that the main obstacles had been overcome. Questions of implementation remained to be agreed. The catalyst, the impending inauguration of President Trump.
They have been involved fully in the talks, as I said, from the Biden administration and the incoming administration. They were working in tandem together here in Doha and beyond in the region to make sure that a deal happens.
Last week, Trump threatened hell to pay if a deal weren't reached before he took office. More emerging now about the role of his Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, who reportedly insisted on meeting the Israeli Prime Minister during the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday, exacting concessions and heading back to the talks. A copy of the agreement obtained by the Associated Press outlines a first 6-week phase during which 33 Israeli hostages, women, children, elderly and injured, would be exchanged for hundreds of Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Among them, 5 Israeli female soldiers would be swapped for 250 Palestinian prisoners, 150 of them on life sentences. Palestinian civilians would be allowed to return to homes in the north if still habitable, and aid would be increased to 600 trucks a day. Israel would withdraw troops from areas such as the Netzarim corridor, which it had wanted to retain to prevent weapon transfer to the north. It would, though, keep troops in the Philadelphia corridor on the Egyptian border. In parallel, negotiations would continue ahead of Phase 2, which would see mainly male soldier hostages exchanged for more Palestinian prisoners and a full Israeli military withdrawal, including from the Egyptian border, something Benjamin Netanyahu had long resisted. For Israeli hostage families, fresh from a meeting with the Prime Minister, the lack of full agreement on that second phase causing concern.
We are demanding from Prime Minister Netanyahu, from Qatar, from President-elect Trump to agree upon all the stages of negotiation and get all the hostages back.
Israel's Prime Minister also under pressure from an Israeli right that had expected very different things of a Trump presidency. His far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir threatening to walk out of the coalition of what he called a deal made for Hamas. The third and final stage of that deal would see a massive reconstruction effort in Gaza. The US Secretary of State saying President Trump's team would take over work already started.
For many months, we've been working intensively with our partners to develop a detailed post-conflict plan that would allow Israel to fully withdraw from Gaza, prevent Hamas from filling back in, and provide for Gaza's governance, security, and reconstruction.
But here too there's huge uncertainty. Hamas, one party to a deal designed eventually to replace it as Gaza's governing entity. For all the skepticism about where this deal may end, one thing goes unquestioned by Israel's hostage families and Gaza's civilians alike. It must at least begin.
Well, in a moment we'll hear the view of the Palestinians. But first I spoke earlier to Israeli hostage negotiator Gershom Baskin. I started by asking what has led to the deal being potentially struck now.
The big difference between what we've seen over the past months and right now is January 20th, when the big T enters the White House once again. And all of them are putting the screws on Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the Qataris and the Egyptians who are putting the screws on Hamas. And all this pressure is working because we're really, really, really close to an agreement.
But hang on a minute. President Biden has at least told us that he's been putting the screws on the Israeli Prime Minister consistently over the last year and a half or so, or since October the 7th, and it hasn't worked. So is Trump's thumbscrew much more powerful than Biden's?
Well, it could also be that Biden wasn't really putting the screws on Israel, because we know at the same time that he said he's drawing red lines and Israel better do this and that, he was sending more and more weapons and more money to Israel. So there was no real pressure felt by Prime Minister Netanyahu from President Biden. And when there's a Democratic administration and a prime minister like Netanyahu in office, he can always go to his Republican friends. Now, Netanyahu has no one to go to complain about the president putting pressure on Israel when it's the president himself from the Republican Party.
And in the interim, waiting for this thing to get implemented, another 10,000 people have been killed.
Another 10,000 people have been killed. A lot of Israeli soldiers have been killed. A lot more suffering has taken place on both sides of the border, mainly in the Gaza Strip. It's really horrible.
Okay, if this deal now goes ahead, does that mean the end of the Netanyahu government?
No, I don't think so. Netanyahu has a majority in his government to pull off the deal. Even if the far extreme right wing opposes it, he will still be in power. The danger to Netanyahu's coalition or to his government is that when the war is over, the call for new elections will grow louder, and the demanding of the Israeli public for a national commission of inquiry to determine how Israel failed to protect itself on October 7th, what led to that, and the dysfunctional nature of the Israeli government since then will all come to a head.
But could he escape defeat in new elections?
Well, all the polls since October 7th of last year show that Netanyahu cannot win another election. The size of his coalition or the ability to form a new government with a majority in the parliament is not there since October 7th.
Finally, and briefly, if you don't mind, 6 months before the Oslo Accords were signed on the South Lawn of the White House, Bill Clinton was president, Yasser Arafat was there, Yitzhak Rabin. You know, the rest is history, as they say. But no one thought at that stage it was possible, and then it was. Do you think something similar could happen on the South Lawn of the Trump White House?
Precisely, and it's not only that example you're giving. We can talk about the Berlin Wall, we can talk about Nelson Mandela, we can talk about Syria and Bashar al-Assad, that no one predicted the day before the Syrian regime fell that it would fall. So yes, I think we're actually closer to a possible Israeli-Palestinian peace deal than anyone can even imagine.
Despite all the horror of the last year?
Because of all the horror of the last year, there are still 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs between the river and the sea. They're not going anywhere, and this has to be the last war. We can't keep doing this.
Gershon Baskin, thank you very much, as ever.
Thank you.
Well, I'm now joined by Mustafa Barghouti, the General Secretary of the Palestinian National Initiative and member of the Palestine Liberation Organization Central Council. Mustafa, it's good to have you back on the program. Let me start with that note of optimism from Gershon Baskin there. You know, although this has been the darkest hour for so many, he thinks that this, because of the horrors of the last year, something positive might come from it, both for the Palestinians and for the Israelis. Do you agree?
I agree that something good could happen, but that is conditioned by a different American position in general and the different position of the Western countries. If these countries tell Israel enough is enough, and you have to end your occupation and end your system of apartheid, and one genocide is enough, we don't need another one, then yes, we can see a future of peace. It all starts with one specific act, ending the Israeli illegal occupation of Palestinian land.
So it's interesting that Gershon Baskin thought it was Donald Trump saying all hell will break loose if the hostages aren't released was aimed actually at Netanyahu and not so much at Hamas, you know, or the Palestinians. Do you think that Trump is good for your cause or bad for your cause?
It depends on his behavior. I mean, it depends on whether he will allow Israel to annex the West Bank, for instance, which would kill completely the possibility of a Palestinian state. It depends if at this very moment he did something positive, which is to pressure Netanyahu, something that Biden couldn't do. And only because there is a pressure from Trump on Netanyahu that we are seeing this deal happening. This deal was there 6 months ago. The Palestinian side had accepted the deal. Netanyahu blocked it. Biden, instead of blaming Netanyahu, lied and claimed that it was the Palestinians who blocked the deal. And we lost in the course of the last 6 months 10,000 Palestinian innocent people. And in that course, he also allowed the killing of many Israeli prisoners. So in reality, we are seeing now a difference, mainly because now Netanyahu understands he cannot play games with Trump. And that means there is an opportunity. If Trump takes the right position and not a position similar to what his
and on that note,
ambassador
indeed, and on that note, yeah, I was just going to ask you about that, Mustafa. I mean, his ambassador to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, Mike Huckabee, refers to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. There are other people in the administration who want to see the annexation of the West Bank. Who do you believe? Do you believe Donald Trump, and we don't know where he stands on that, or do you believe those people?
Well, as you know, it's very difficult to expect exactly what Trump would do. We will see. But judging what his appointees are saying, including Huckabee and including the new defense, the one proposed to become the Secretary of Defense, it's very alarming when Huckabee says that Palestinians don't exist and that we are simply an invention to take away land from Israel. And denies the Palestinian presence completely and claims there are no settlements and there is no occupation. Of course, this is a frank violation of every aspect of international law. And that means all these people who are around Trump are very dangerous. And very dangerous to the future, because that could mean not only the continuation of genocide that is happening in Gaza, but also destroying any potential for peace. One thing that has to be clear: if Israel kills the potential for two-state solution and for a Palestinian state, the only solution will be one democratic state for everybody. We will never accept ethnic cleansing, and we will never accept to be subjugated to apartheid.
Got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Mustafa Barghouti, thank you very much indeed.